Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you on Thursday, 23rd of March. I'm Cindy Yu, the Spectator's assistant editor. Coming up on the show, Boris Johnson is in the news again, but is his time in the limelight well and truly over? I'll be speaking to Katy Balls. The pandemic might be over, but it turns out there are over 100,000 children who never returned to school after they were closed during lockdown. What's going on? Harriet Sergeant looks at Britain's ghost children for the cover piece this week. She joins me on the show, along with Miriam Cates MP. From education to policing, the Met Police have received another damning report this week. Is the force beyond repair? Danny Shaw has been looking at the story, and he joins me on the show. And over to the east, Xi has just returned to China after 3 days in Moscow. Is Chinese neutrality on the Ukraine war slipping? And what else is Xi looking at to get out of his friendship with Putin? Gideon Rachman joins me to discuss. And finally, a crash course on exoplanets. Now, if you have no idea what they are, stay tuned, as astronomer Sasha Hinckley tells me all about them and why there just may be life in outer space. Before we get going, if you enjoy Spectator TV, then do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. And if you want to read more from The Spectator, then why not subscribe to the magazine too? For just £12, you can get 12 weeks in print and online and a free £20 Amazon voucher. Just go to spectator.co.uk/TV offer to subscribe. First up, we looked yesterday at the trial of Boris on Spectator TV following his Partygate probe. Was the entire day, along with the tiny Brexit rebellion, simply unedifying for the former Prime Minister? With me to discuss is our political editor, Katy Balls. Now, Katy, I won't make you recall everything that went on Wednesday in Parliament because you and Fraser already did that in that Spectator TV special yesterday. But tell me, is everything that has happened over the course of this week showing that the Boris Johnson supporters, that faction in Parliament, is now a bit of a spent force?
Yeah, I think it is fair to say it hasn't been a good week for Boris Johnson. You never quite know if these, the famous Boris Johnson quote, which is, there's no such thing as disaster, only fresh opportunities, fresh disasters. They can often turn from one to the other. So you don't know what's coming around the corner. But I think in terms of this week alone, the Privileges Committee, I would say actually was perhaps a score draw in terms of Boris Johnson, in the sense that there wasn't really a smoking gun which moved the picture on. I think if you already thought Boris Johnson was guilty of deliberately misleading Parliament, your opinion probably won't have changed. And if you already thought Boris Johnson was innocent, was being ganged up on, you could probably also hold that opinion from how it all played out. And because so much of the evidence was put in advance, there are tricky questions for Boris Johnson when it comes to his statements to Parliament. He himself has said this week that he did mislead the House. He is just saying that he didn't do so intentionally. And I think what's probably the trickiest thing is the fact that some of his colleagues at the time are saying, oh, well, I did say I didn't give this complete assurance, which you sometimes get the impression from Boris Johnson he's claiming he did get. But in terms of moving things on, I don't think it moved the dial so much in terms of this big session. And
what about the Brexit vote then? Because that also happened during the committee hearing, and we heard in the morning of Wednesday that Boris Johnson was going to vote against.
So I think this is actually the more significant in terms of Boris Johnson's position within the Tory party. Of course, the Privileges Committee could lead to a by-election depending on the suspension, so that will have a very material effect if so. But when it comes to the vote on the Windsor Framework, I think it's interesting first that you had a situation where Rishi Sunak chose to hold that vote on Wednesday when he knew Boris Johnson was going to be in Parliament. Boris Johnson is not in Parliament every day. And therefore it was almost, I think, some will say, oh, it's just a coincidence. I think these things in politics are rarely pure coincidence. I think it was almost saying to Boris Johnson, put your money where your mouth is. You said you don't like this deal. You've got no excuse, either back it or don't back it. He chose to vote against it. But it was quite a small number of Tory MPs voting against it. That's 22. Now, there's lots of different spin going around about what this result means. The ERG, well, at least one figure was suggesting that actually, if you look at the abstentions, so those who did not vote either way, despite it being a three-line whip, that's 48 Tory MPs. If you add it up, if you imagine that every opposition MP voted against it, the government would not have a working majority. However, it's always a bit more complicated than that. The abstentions included Grant Shapps, who was a cabinet minister. People are allowed to miss the vote through pairing. So there will be some who chose to abstain because they don't like the policy. There'll be some who just missed the vote for other reasons. And also to choose to abstain rather than to vote against is a choice. That is choose to be less of a problem for the government. And that means there are 22 Tory MPs who either dislike Rishi Sunak or dislike the deal that much. That's not such a bad figure. If you think in February, there are warnings that up to 100 Tory MPs could vote against any New Deal in the protocol, it meant that Rishi Sunak, I don't think, did have to rely on Labour votes.
Well, especially because the DUP and the ERG both explicitly came out against that. Do you think Number 10 was surprised by this, how small the rebellion was?
I don't think they were surprised, and I think that they still would have liked it to be smaller. I think, on a serious point, it is a blow to Rishi Sunak that the DUP have all voted against the Windsor framework. And I think there was a hope that, for example, the DUP leader Geoffrey Donaldson would abstain. And I think that probably matters more than the Tory MP rebellion, because what does that mean for bringing up power sharing and Stormont? So had the DUP, decided to abstain from this, you've perhaps had fewer Tory rebels, but this is very far from the disaster, which I think it could have been for Rishi Sunak had things, tensions ran higher.
Yeah, and I saw that Steve Baker had been kicked out of an ERG WhatsApp group. Is that right? I mean, he's had quite a Damascene conversion to the Rishi Sunak cause.
Yeah, in a way, it feels a little bit this week as though perhaps we're reaching a bit of an end of an era on some of the Brexit fighting. Now, this could be very famous last words, and we'll be back in a few weeks, and I'll be telling you all of Rishi Sunak's problems and how the ERG are going to bring him down. But Steve Baker, obviously now a minister in government, former head of the ERG, has been backing this deal. Lots of people thought he might resign over it. Instead, he's been one of the most passionate defenders of it, saying, look, it might not be completely perfect, but it's the best thing for the people of Northern Ireland. And ultimately accused Boris Johnson in an interview on the day of the vote of saying he shouldn't vote against it. He shouldn't be a pound shop Nigel Farage. Now, this led to the ERG kicking him out of a WhatsApp group. And I think in the past, Steve Baker has kicked figures out of WhatsApp groups. But ultimately, where does this lead the European Research Group? I think it's partly parliamentary arithmetic, but they just do not, at least for now, hold the same power as they did a few years ago in terms of bellwethers of Tory party opinion.
And Katy, I want to find out from you what happens with Boris Johnson from here. But first, just staying on this idea of Rishi Sunak doing relatively well, is there a feeling in Westminster that actually he is not doomed in the next election, that he's actually performing better than people expected?
No, I think it depends who you speak to. I think in Westminster, and also as journalists, we could often jump from one extreme to another. So if you think back to perhaps a year and a half ago when lots of people were predicting after local elections, 10 more years of Boris Johnson, saying, he's impossible to move, then you get to a situation where I think there's pretty baked in consensus of Labour heading to a large majority. I think what we are seeing is the Tories are not, completely done yet. And we have a situation where actually, you saw it after Liz Truss stepped down. There was a point when lots of Tory MPs did look a bit into the abyss and think, what happens if we keep fighting? And they didn't like it. And now and then you see them moving back towards it. But I think a period of calm, Rishi Sunak has managed to make the political weather, and means that people are reassessing him and thinking that at the very least, the next election will be more competitive than it seemed a while ago. I mean, we had one poll this week that suggested the Labour lead was down to 10 points. Now, other polls suggest that it is nowhere near that, and it's still a steady 20-something lead. If you get to a consistent 10-point lead, that's obviously still significant for Labour, but some Labour politicians will start to worry that if they've gone from a 30-something lead to a 10-point, how much tighter is it going to get ahead of the next election? And does Keir Starmer need to be doing things differently?
And finally, in terms of procedure then, Katy, where does Boris Johnson go from here?
So we still have quite a wait. I was speaking to one figure who thought perhaps after the Privileges Committee it'd be half an hour and then they'd announce their verdict. No such thing. It will take weeks and months likely. We might not even get their report till after the local elections. There's no specific date yet. They will they will say whether or not they found Boris Johnson guilty as charged. And then if they have found him to have intentionally or recklessly misled Parliament, they will recommend a punishment. Now, the key thing here is if it is a suspension, is it 10 sitting days or more? If it is 10 sitting days or more, then that would mean that Boris Johnson was vulnerable to a recall petition that can then pave the way to a by-election. with the punishment does have to be voted on in the House of Commons. Rishi Sunak has said that would be a free vote. They're not going to try and tell MPs they have to back Boris Johnson or not back him. And that's convention with these types of votes. But I think it's very likely the punishment would pass, if there's not any whipping going on. And then in a by-election, well, let's see. I was talking earlier with some MPs about what could make things, good or bad for Boris Johnson. Looking at the polls, a by-election does not look very good for Boris Johnson, but there are quite a few Tory MPs, and these aren't all the hardline Boris Johnson supporters who actually think he could potentially be in a chance of defending it. And I wonder, actually, if Boris Johnson somehow won a by-election brought by the Privileges Committee, is that the moment people will start to have more enthusiasm? You'd hear all his supporters suddenly saying, "See, we told you, he's an election winner."
The chosen one. Katy, thank you so much. Next, new figures have emerged that 140,000 children never returned to school after lockdown. Journalist and author Harriet Sergeant has spent the last year documenting some of Britain's ghost children, and the think tank, the Centre for Social Justice, has also released a new report on this issue. Harriet's written about it for the cover piece in a magazine this week, and she joins me now, along with Conservative MP Miriam, who sits on the Education Select Committee. Harriet and Miriam, welcome to Spectator TV. Thank you so much for your time today. Now, Harriet, you've written in a magazine about the plight of Britain's ghost children. 140,000 of them in the country. What's happened to these children?
Well, this is quite extraordinary because in 2019, there were 60,000 children who were out of school more than they spent time in school. Now we're, how many years are we from finishing lockdown? And yet the numbers are going up. I mean, last year when I first looked at it, it was 100,000. So this is a quite extraordinary increase. And from all this excellent report from the Centre for Social Justice saying that the figures are going to keep going up because this is a problem that has not been recognised by government and which government are doing nothing about.
That's incredible. And it falls on a Centre for Social Justice and journalists like yourself to bring into light this information. I mean, it is quite shocking, actually. Why do you think the numbers are going up since the end of lockdown?
I think that nobody has realised quite the long-term damage that has been done to these kids. I mean, I interviewed an awful lot of them, and they seem to fall in two parts. There seem to be those that, and generally these are girls, but not necessarily, that just can't go out of their room. They're just crippled by anxiety. They are really distressed. They essentially won't go out of their room. If they do go to school, they manage like one morning and then they go home. And then there are the other extreme, mainly boys, but not always, who won't go back home, who are out on the streets, who are into all kinds of things that they really shouldn't be into, and are angry and are bitter and feel that they've simply, I mean, I interviewed one in Streatham High Street who said, he was hoping to get his results to go to college, and he never got them, and his dreams are broken. And there's young people like this, young apprentices all over the country whose dreams have been broken and can't get those years back.
And Miriam, as an MP and a mother of three, you were one of the few politicians to speak out against school closures during the lockdown. I mean, is this the kind of scenario that you thought might have happened?
Well, of course, these are difficult decisions, and I wouldn't have wanted to be in any of their shoes. And, the former Prime Minister has obviously been grilled this week. But I think we have a blind spot in this country over children's welfare. And that wasn't just around the pandemic and lockdowns. We can see that in many areas of our life and politics. But I think children always should be the first priority. They are our future. And we talk a lot about vulnerable groups, and rightly so, but the only truly vulnerable group in society that we ought to be protecting at all times is children. And we completely lost sight of them. And of course, it's good to protect elderly people. Of course, it's good to protect people with health challenges. But actually, our top priority, our number one priority, should have been children, given what we did know about the disease at that point, which was that it was very, very harmless to children. So I think it's just indicative of a wider blind spot that we have in our politics, which is not putting children first. And I think it was worse than that. We actually used children as a buffer against the disease, and to make older people feel safer, which again, you can understand politically, but I think was the wrong choice.
Yeah, well, just on that, Harriet, when it comes to this disparity, this adults not understanding children, what I was struck by in your piece was how often kids knew what was going on. Kids knew that their friends hadn't come back to school, but they had to go tell the teachers, who then had to contact parents. So it seemed like the adults just didn't have a grip on what was going on, whether that's teachers, parents, or politicians indeed. But the kids knew what was going on.
Well, I mean, this very sad story that you mentioned about one girl told me that a boy had dropped out of school, and she suddenly saw him sitting by the side of the road looking homeless, just on a bit of cardboard, very dirty, very shabby. And she said he'd always been popular at school, so all the other kids were buying him food, bringing him clothes. And finally, someone told the teacher. So they got the boy back into school, but he was so far behind, and this is something that seems to have affected a lot of kids, where they get back into school, they're so far behind, and he got very angry, and he left and hasn't really been seen again.
How much of it do you think is a poverty issue, is a class issue? So like parents who are, time poor, resource poor, just don't have the time to get their kids back into school?
Well, I mean, that was very interesting because there was definitely the kids, the most vulnerable kids in disadvantaged areas on free school meals. They all have double the rates of sort of dropping out to their contemporaries. And certainly there are children who, I mean, I know because I befriended 4 boys from a South London gang about 15 years ago, and they are at the age of 15 had dropped out. I mean, there've always been kids that had dropped out, and they were, drug dealing and mugging rather than going to school. But look what's happened to them. I mean, they, in the last 15 years, have been in and out of prison.
Sets you on a path, doesn't it?
Yes, and at great cost to themselves and to us taxpayers.
Yeah.
And how are we going to cope with now, not 60,000 children, but 140,000 and rising? How are we going to cope with these numbers of children if they start going through the criminal justice system? I mean, there doesn't seem to be one government institution who speaks for them. I mean, there's the Children's Commissioner, but and they're very eloquent, but they don't have the power.
Yeah, of
Who's
course.
going to take responsibility for them?
Well, Miriam, let me ask you this question as the politician in this conversation. I mean, where were the adults during the pandemic? Ofsted, the Department of Education, the Children's Commissioner, who I know has been looking at this, but clearly not enough has been done.
Well, I think the Children's Commissioner is excellent, and she does a great job of shedding light on some of these issues. But I think, as Harriet says in her article, she doesn't have any power. And I think the recommendations that the CSJ have made in their report are excellent about much more bespoke relationships to try and get children back into school rather than a one-size-fits-all finding approach or something like that. So I think there's some good recommendations. But it's a good question. Whose responsibility is it? And I think, again, one of the problems that potentially existed before lockdown but was made very visible during lockdown is that as a society, we've kind of privatized family life, and we think that all you need is the nuclear family and all you need is the household, and that if you just have to retreat into your household for 2 years, well, that's fine. But of course it's not fine. We exist, we are social beings, we need each other, not just for resources and economic purposes, but also for company, for learning, all these things that we interdepend on each other for. And you cannot just reduce that to household units. It doesn't work. And again, who is going to take responsibility for that? I don't know. Of course, part of it is the government's responsibility, but it's a whole society responsibility. And let's not forget, it wasn't only the government that was shutting schools down. Teaching unions were calling for it. Some parents were calling for it. The media was certainly calling for it. It actually would have been very difficult for the government not to do it from a political point of view. So we all share that responsibility as a society. We were all obsessed with the death figures and the hospital figures and wearing masks and how the virus travelled. This was a national obsession, and maybe understandably, but very few people in any walk of life were speaking up for the impact on children. And I think we're reaping that now, not just in educational loss, but in whole culture shifts about whether education is optional or not, the value that people place on education. It's going to take a long time to row back.
So, Miriam, what do you think needs to be done now? I mean, Harriet writes very well in her piece about how visitations for early years is still not back. You know, some of these things are still not back to normal, as we've heard about. These ghost children are actually increasing in number, not decreasing. So what is to be done now that we're out of the pandemic, and what is the government doing about it?
Well, again, in the report, one of the recommendations is for an increased number of attendance officers. That sounds a bit formal, but people to go around building relationships with families that are struggling and coaching them back into school, into early years, into society. And I do think that's the right approach. I don't think fining everybody or, changing guidance across the board or anything like that is going to help. We need a bespoke approach. So I think that is a good idea. But I also think we need a mea culpa, really. We need some adults somewhere to stand up and say, kids, we got this wrong. This was not in your best interests. Education shouldn't be optional. You can't thrive at home on your own. You need to be back at school. Now, that might seem a bit tokenistic, but I think when adults get things wrong, and we know this as parents, it's important to own that. Otherwise, how do the children know that a mistake was made and actually you're taking a new approach? So I do think we need that. The government kind of got into that space a year ago. Nadeem Zahawi said it was a mistake to close schools, which I think was a very brave thing to do. But we need something much bigger than that to encourage children to come back. But, these issues are very complex. There's not just one group of children that's struggling. Yes, deprivation. Yes, special educational needs, girls with anxiety, boys who think that the education system has failed them anyway and now have seen all their extracurricular activities cancelled to try and give them more maths lessons. There's a lot of questions we can ask about the education system. But I do think as adults, we need to signal that we got it wrong.
Harriet?
Yes, I mean, a lot of the children I interviewed were very angry with their schools. And that's part of the problem because their schools did nothing. Yeah. And the other thing that I found so extraordinary was the variability. You know, some schools went out of their way to reach their children, see their children, even feed their children, I mean, as well as teach them. And others did absolutely nothing. I mean, I had one boy who was meant to be at an outstanding school in a sort of leafy suburb, very competitive, and he gave up and started to despair because nobody was marking his work. He was doing all his work and then no single teacher could be bothered to mark his work. And he got very bitter.
Of course.
And this is true of many of the kids that I interviewed. So they're not going back into those schools because when it was important, those teachers didn't care for them. So why should they go back and give them a second chance?
Yes, of course. I mean, do you think, Harriet, that Ofsted needs to be overhauled somewhat or just looked at? I mean, if this outstanding school had teachers like...
What was the Department of Education doing? I'm sorry. Why was the Department of Education saying, hello, why are some schools, busting a gut to teach children and other schools doing nothing? They were doing nothing. I find it quite extraordinary. And also within schools, I mean, one girl said she had a great history teacher who was never stopped contacting her, but her English teacher she never heard of. Well, why was that being allowed to happen?
Yeah.
It seems quite extraordinary.
Absolutely. Miriam, do you think that looking ahead, if there were to be, God forbid, another pandemic or whatever it is, we would think a bit more long-term about this when it comes to kids?
Well, I hope so. And the evidence is obviously compelling and compounding in terms of the impact on children. Of course, it would depend on the nature of the pandemic. I mean, I wouldn't be saying all this if we were talking about disease which had a 50% mortality rate for children. We have to get this in proportion. The reason it was the wrong policy was because this disease was so harmless to children. And actually, although, unfortunately, lots of people did die of or with COVID, the vast majority of those that died were elderly and that, around the age of life expectancy in this country, which is of course sad, but is not the same as lots and lots of young people dying from this virus. So it would depend on the pandemic. But I think we've got so much evidence now that, yes, I hope it would be different. But the COVID inquiry, when the terms of reference were first published, didn't even mention children and schooling. And that is a worry. We need to make sure that the impact on children is front and centre of the inquiry so that we don't forget it and we make sure we use that information in future.
Really great to hear from you, Miriam Cates. Thank you so much for joining Spectator TV, and Harriet Sergeant too.
Thank you.
This week, Baroness Louise Casey published a damning report into the Met's so-called rotten culture, accusing the force of being a cesspit of institutional prejudice. Danny Shaw is a journalist and formerly the BBC's Home Affairs correspondent. He's gone through the report in detail. He joins me now on the show. Danny, welcome to Spectator TV. Now, throughout your career, you've been looking at the Met Police up close and personal. And what did you make of Louise Casey's review and the findings from it?
I think it's a devastating report. And what Louise Casey has done in the space of 12 months is really impressive. She has got under the surface of the Metropolitan Police in a way that I don't think anyone else has. No other inquiry, inspection or report has done that. It's probably the most significant report into the Met Police. That's obviously the UK's biggest police force since the Macpherson inquiry report in 1999. The difference with the Macpherson report was that was looking really at the issues of race in particular and the way that murder inquiries were dealt with and victims were treated. This is a much more comprehensive report that's looking at the culture of the Met, the management, issues of discrimination, violence against women and girls. And Louise Casey, has evidenced all her findings through survey data, through interviews with people, case studies, and it's a comprehensive volume of report. I've got it here, and if anyone's got time, have a look through on your website, pick up a copy if you possibly can, because it really shows you that within a small space of time, you can get to the root of particular problems with a fierce sort of drive. To be honest, it puts a lot of public inquiries and other investigations to shame, because she's managed to do in 12 months what it takes inquiries, years to achieve.
And you say that what she found was damning. Can you tell us what does she find?
Well, her key finding is a finding of institutional racism, misogyny and homophobia across the Metropolitan Police. And discrimination, she says, is baked in to the force. There's a willful blindness to racism. She singles out two units in the Met for particular criticism. MO19, which is the Firearms Command, and also the Parliamentary and Diplomatic Protection Group as well. And says that, there's an insidious culture in those organisations. They're dominated by men. There's some really bad practice and bad conduct that goes on. She says that the management of the Met is really uncoordinated. Alarmingly, there seems to be a lack of strategy, a lack of sort of forward planning. And there's a real imbalance between the centre of the Met, the HQ, New Scotland Yard on the embankment, and the boroughs, where local policing, frontline policing takes place. And on violence against women and girls, Louise Casey is incredibly critical, because she says that the Met strategy to do that really rings hollow, because the resources, the attention, the specialist skills that are devoted to that are just inadequate.
I mean, that's fascinating, because we hear so much these days about institutional racism, institutional sexism. I think some viewers might be sceptical that in a lot of these cases of allegations surrounding those words, that they're actually fair, or that they're even relevant to the question at hand. I mean, how much of this is police dealing with incredibly stressful circumstances? For example, some of the cases that we've heard about bantering WhatsApp groups that are completely insensitive, but ultimately probably harmless? Or how much of it is actually impacting the police's ability to do their work?
Well, it does impact their ability to do their work, because if you're dealing with a city like London, which has so many different ethnic groups, cultures, visitors, tourists, languages spoken, etc. If you don't have an attitude that you deal with people fairly and equally, no matter what their background, no matter the colour of their skin, then you're not going to be giving a good service to people in London. I mean, that stands to reason. And so some of those attitudes that are expressed by people in the force, they might be about their colleagues, the way that they're treated. If that's reflected in the treatment of the people that they're there to serve, then that has a terrible effect. And it's also evidenced by the data. We know, for example, that black people are more likely to be stopped and searched. They're more likely to be subject to taser. They're more likely to be restrained in police custody and so on, all those sorts of metrics. And as well as that, there's other information which shows that when people from ethnic minorities in the police raise concerns, raise complaints, then they are more likely to be subject to allegations themselves and are therefore put through the misconduct process disproportionately. So that all affects the service that Londoners get. If it can't treat its own staff well, how do they expect to treat the people of London?
Yes, I mean, I saw a shocking statistic. I think it was in the report that said over 80% of officers who had allegations of domestic abuse levied against them were still in work rather than being investigated. I mean, when it comes to all of these things, do you think that there's a vetting issue here, or is it a power problem where people, the power gets to your head? I mean, for example, those two units that you mentioned, they're both elite forces. Is that what the problem is here, that the wrong kind of person are getting into these jobs and they have a lot of power over others?
There's no quick answer or one answer. The vetting system, the Casey review finds, is broken, and I think we know that from the cases of David Carrick, the multiple rapist, and domestic abuser who was in the Met for years, and numerous opportunities to root him out were missed. He should never have been recruited. We know that there are serious problems with the vetting process, and some of those we hope are being fixed, and there are efforts to do that. But it's also because the police service does attract particular individuals. There are some people attracted to policing because it gives them power. It gives them a uniform, a warrant card, and weapons. And so the police service needs to be alive to that. And I don't think they have been sufficiently alive to that particular problem. And those units in particular do attract a certain kind of individual. Look, there are many, many highly skilled professional people that work in the firearms unit who carry guns and make split-second decisions that will potentially save people's lives and stop terror attacks and so on. And we need to be enormously grateful for the work that they do. But at the same time, those units are dominated by a particular type of people, particular gender, particular ethnicity, and that has bred certain cultures which the Casey review finds are really toxic.
Yeah. And Danny, just on the topic of other crimes, as you mentioned terrorism, what about petty crimes? Because I think it's not just Londoners who feel like there's no point in reporting a burglary or stolen bike or anything these days. And I think there are numbers to back up that the fact that, even though there are more cases of these minor crimes in recent years, fewer and fewer of them actually get investigated and prosecuted. How does that relate to the topic that we're talking about right now?
Well, what the report does really well is shine a light on the inadequacies of frontline policing, where the majority of those sort of fairly routine crimes are dealt with, the burglaries, the shoplifting, the thefts, car thefts, and so on. And what it shows is that resources for frontline policing have been eroded over the years, partly because of austerity and partly because of choices that the Metropolitan Police made to prioritise other areas and to reorganise the force in a way where the boroughs don't really have the influence and resources that they need. And so all that, I think, is playing out into the proportion of cases that make it through the criminal justice system. We know that the charging levels overall across England and Wales are around 5 to 6%. So 5 to 6 out of 100 crimes that are recorded by police actually end up in court. The vast majority of crimes never get anywhere near a courtroom. Now, those figures are not just about the Met. They're about, across the country. And it's a source of great alarm, I think, for all of us.
And finally, Danny, what is the solution here then?
Well, there's no one simple solution. Cultural change will take a long period of time to effect. There is some good leadership at the Met with Sir Mark Rowley and Dame Lynn Owens. But I think there is the need now for some structural changes. Certainly, we need a plan for a structural change. The Met is not working the way it is. What I call for is for more responsibility and accountability and resources to local levels, local boroughs. The Metropolitan Police is split into 12 basic command units, which are made up of 2 or 3 boroughs. And each of those areas has a complement of police officers that's in excess of some police forces outside London. And yet those areas are not the responsibility of a chief constable, as, for example, Norfolk Police is, but they're the responsibility of a commander. just above the level of chief superintendent. Now that's madness. You can't put someone at that rank in charge of such a large area and expect a decent policing job to be done. We need a shift of resources and expertise to local boroughs to ensure that we get better neighbourhood policing. That will certainly be a start. Changing the culture, I suspect, will take a lot longer.
As ever. Danny Shaw, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. Now, if you enjoy Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine? For just £12, you can get 12 issues in print and online and a free £20 Amazon gift voucher. Just go to spectator.co.uk/TV offer to subscribe. What to make of Xi Jinping's visit to Putin this week? Has Russia been well and truly sucked into China's orbit? Joining me to discuss is Gideon Rachman, who's the Chief Foreign Affairs Commentator for the Financial Times. Gideon Rachman, thank you so much for joining us on Spectator TV. Now, this week Xi Jinping visited Putin in Russia and it was full of pomp as expected. What was your takeaway from that 3-day meeting?
Well, I mean, I think that more or less as expected, it was kind of big reassertion of Russian-Chinese friendship and based around, I think, a mutual antipathy towards the United States. And if you read the closing document, it kind of reiterates the idea that this is all America's fault, that America is out to cement its global hegemony, and that both Russia and China are kind of have been targeted by America, and that their joint interest is in pushing back against that. I think there was actually rather less on the peace initiative for Ukraine. I never took that seriously, but I thought they would make more of it. But there's, if you look at the 9-point statement, it's not really very much emphasized. So I don't think even for public relations purposes, they're making much of the idea that China is going to bring peace to Ukraine. I think the big issue, though, that you wouldn't really expect them to address publicly, but that the Americans and everybody will be watching very closely, is China prepared to give Russia weapons, and in particular artillery shells? Because the Russians seem to be running out of those. Their bombardments of Ukrainian infrastructure are fairly sporadic now, and that's probably because they don't have enough missiles. But China has a lot. They use the same kinds of missiles that the Russians use. So if they were to ship them over to Ukraine, that would be a big game changer in the war. So far, there was certainly no public statement of that, but everybody watching quite closely, I mean, not just in the next weeks, but in the coming months, as to whether China's prepared to back up its rhetoric with explicit military support for Russia.
And I want to get on to that military support point in just a little bit, Gideon. But first of all, your point about it not actually being as much about mediation as it might have seemed before the visit. I mean, Xi Jinping seemed like he had a wish list of things that he went to get for China itself, including, for example, this Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, which now channels Russian gas to China instead of to Europe. Is that what he's there for, but mainly to get Chinese national interests satisfied?
Well, I mean, I think actually, talking to the experts, it looks like Russia is keener on the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline than the Chinese, because there's already Power of Siberia 1, it's a bit like Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, and that's the one that takes gas to China from nearby fields. Russia has a dilemma now because all the gas that it was selling to Europe, it can't sell to Europe now. It has been doing so over the last year, but the Europeans have basically been devoting themselves to the last year to finding other sources, LNG or renewables, whatever. And now Russia's got this gas that they may not be able to sell, so they need a second pipeline to get it to China. But even on the Russian timetable, that won't be until 2030. And then I think that clearly, a lot of Russians are concerned, maybe not willing to express it publicly unless they're in the opposition, about Russia's growing economic dependence on China. That if you read the statement, it's all about this is a relationship of equals, but it looks increasingly unequal because essentially the Russian economy was already much smaller than that of China. It's under massive sanctions from the West. So, from anything from semiconductors, 5G, consumer goods they can't get from the West, they've all got to get it all from China. And that puts Xi in an immensely powerful position. And even if he didn't exploit it that much now, I think it must make the Russians a little bit nervous about how that relationship is going to unfold. Because, I mean, if you're looking really kind of back into history, that, as you know, Cindy, a lot of what is Russia now was China in the 19th century. And now, of course, the Russians and Chinese say, and it's technically true, they don't have a border dispute, it's all settled. But I think some Russians are worried about that in the background.
Absolutely. And when it comes to this dialogue between China and Russia, then, Gideon, I mean, some on the Chinese side might say that that's what makes China the perfect mediator if it ever came to that. That's why its peace plan is relatively sincere and substantiated, because you need a mediator that can talk to both sides in order to do that. And China might point to the Iran-Saudi Arabia deal that it recently brokered, where those two countries hadn't been speaking since 2016 and now are, thanks to China's negotiations. What do you say to those people?
Well, I think it's not obviously unreasonable point. I mean, I think that if you wanted a mediator, you need somebody who can talk to Russia. And, people have floated India maybe, or Turkey. I think the difficulty is that although China presents itself as neutral in this conflict, it's not really perceived that way in the West, because they have had this, or possibly more importantly in Ukraine, they have had these protestations of unlimited friendship, which actually are interestingly a phrase that did not recur in this latest statement, which suggests to me the Chinese might slightly regret that because it's been thrown at them so much. But, the spirit of limitless friendship is still there in the statement. And I think that the Ukrainians say, well, fine, we don't mind if China can mediate, and we accept that, as we were saying, China's got a lot of leverage over Russia if it wants to use it. But that the Chinese have at no point condemned the Russian invasion. And they have at no point said, well, Russia's got to give back the occupied Ukrainian land. I think even if they were to be neutral on Crimea, if they were to just say, look, well, Russia's got to withdraw to the lines it was before the invasion a year ago, that might be seen as a kind of earnest of good faith enough in Kiev to make them feel, well, okay, they could talk. But I think if they're not prepared to do that, and if they endorse the kind of Russian worldview, which is this is a proxy war fought by the United States, this has really got nothing to do with Ukraine's own volition, then I think they kind of lack credibility in this. And I think that, as you say, the Saudi-Iran thing was really interesting. And I think a big breakthrough for the Chinese, and one they can be, maybe justifiably proud of. But it was a very different situation. The Saudis and the Iranians wanted to come to a deal. They had been talking behind the scenes for about 18 months. And the Chinese were able to step in at the last moment and, provide literally the good officers. They can meet in Beijing and provide a hall and do that. But I don't think that this conflict is similar, because the two sides are not looking to settle.
And of course, you're absolutely right to say China is not completely neutral on this. I mean, it is talking to Russia, but President Xi hasn't spoken to President Zelensky at all since the invasion started. But we're hearing that a phone call might happen at some point this week. Do you think Ukraine has slightly more complicated relationship to handle here with China? Because when and if the war ends, presumably Ukraine wants Chinese investment to resume in the way that they had before the war.
Yeah, I think so. The Ukrainians obviously, even in the midst of a war, have to be reasonably pragmatic and try to think about what the world might look like afterwards. And, there is a lot of Chinese investment through the Belt and Road going across the Eurasian landmass. Chinese construction firms could potentially, if they're big UN contracts, play a role in Ukraine. And why make an enemy prematurely if you don't need to? But that said, I think it was extremely interesting that in the very days in which Xi was in Moscow, Kishida, the Prime Minister of Japan, was in Kiev. And so you almost feel like the two great rivals in East Asia are picking different sides of this war. And sort of, for all the talk of proxy war, maybe it's now also becoming a proxy rivalry between China and Japan.
Goody. And Gideon, finally, you mentioned military aid at the beginning. On the latest Chinese Whispers, my podcast, I spoke to Senior Colonel Zhou Bo, who used to be in the People's Liberation Army, so pretty much as establishment as you can get. And I know that he's written for the Financial Times previously as well. And he was pretty clear that the Chinese would not be giving military arms, not because he was trying to spin me necessarily, but because he was saying wouldn't be in China's interest to get involved in that way, because then China China then becomes even more of a baddie. But you don't seem to think that that completely rules out this idea of military involvement.
No, I mean, I don't. I mean, I hope he's right, because obviously it would be a really dangerous escalation if they did it, and very bad news for Ukraine, incidentally. But I suspect that, Beijing is a bit like Washington or Moscow. There are debates. They may be a bit more hidden in a society like China's, where they don't obviously encourage people to dissent from whatever the line is. But there will be discussions going on. I would imagine that there's a counter school that will say, look, what Putin and Xi said is correct. America's targeting both of us, and we cannot afford to let Russia lose. So they may not do it now, but if they actually saw a real danger of Russian capitulation, there might be a temptation to do it. Just as, if Kiev was suddenly under threat again, a lot of people in the West would say, get as much aid as you can to Ukraine fast. I think that, a stalemate they can live with, a Russian defeat might, or the prospect of a Russian defeat, might open up the question of direct military aid. Or, it may even be under discussion now. The Americans say that actually they think the Chinese are sending stuff to Russia. Not yet the very visible artillery shells that would be crucial, but drone technology. There's some, a large consignment of what were called hunting rifles went from China to Russia, semiconductors with dual use, that kind of thing. And they can always route stuff, through third parties. So I think the US is pretty concerned about this, and presumably they are listening to and watching what's going on in Beijing quite closely.
Great to have you on the show. Thank you so much, Gideon. And finally, it's been just over a year since the James Webb Telescope was launched by NASA, and scientists have now spotted more than 5,000 planets beyond our solar system. But the estimate for those we haven't discovered is, well, very much more. What do we know about these mystery planets, and what does this mean for humanity's search for alien life? I'm joined by the Professor of Physics and Astronomy at Exeter University, Sasha Hinckley. Sasha, welcome to Spectator TV. Perhaps a good place to start today would be just to talk about your role on the James Webb Telescope, leading these 120 scientists. What is it?
Well, I've been really fortunate actually to be one of the first, leading a team that is getting some of the first observations from the James Webb Space Telescope, or JWST as we call it. The institute that runs the James Webb Space Telescope wanted to see whole communities come together and sort of test drive this observatory for the first time, because this is by far the most technologically advanced observatory that NASA has ever launched into space. And they really wanted to make sure that we understand early on how to use this, and specifically for these really challenging observations like detecting extrasolar planets.
Mm-hmm. And these are shortened to exoplanets. So tell us, what is an exoplanet?
So an exoplanet is short for extrasolar planet, and this is a planet that is orbiting a star other than our own sun. And about 30 years ago, we only sort of hypothesized that these things might exist, but now we know of thousands. It's just been an explosion actually in our knowledge about extrasolar planets, exoplanets, and now we're starting to characterize them in detail and learn things about their compositions, whether they have atmospheres, oceans, things like that.
So have we found water outside of the solar system then?
Yes, plenty. Water is actually an incredibly abundant constituent of atmospheres of extrasolar planets, but we don't actually know yet whether these exoplanets have oceans on them yet, but we certainly have detected water in these atmospheres of these planets.
Sasha, this might be a stupid question, but how do we detect water or any other chemical components in these planets, which are presumably very, very far away?
That's not at all a stupid question. Actually, it's a very sort of challenging and interesting question. Astronomers we're a bit of an odd bunch, really, because we're not as lucky as biologists or chemists, where if we want to make a measurement, we can go into our laboratory and use a ruler or a scale or a magnifying glass or something. Astronomers have to get all of our information just from the very, very faint light that comes from whatever object it is we're observing. So typically what we do is we break this light into its constituent wavelengths and search for the chemical signatures of whatever it is we're looking for within this light.
So could you explain that a little bit more?
Absolutely. So on a rainy day, just as a rain shower might break the sunlight into its constituent colors, we do the same thing. We actually take light that's a combination of many, many different colors from a star or an exoplanet, and we break it up into its constituent wavelengths or light, colors of light, if you will. And the degree to which it has more or less water, carbon dioxide, methane, something like that, the various levels of these colors of light will go up and down. And so this provides sort of a signature for detecting these various compounds like water, like you mentioned.
That's amazing. And obviously we're trying to learn all about this, as you say in the piece, is to understand how planets are formed and how planets die. But you also say in the piece that this could help us find alien life forms as well. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so what if I told you that I think it's quite likely that we're probably going to collect evidence for biosignatures, which could mean life on another planet, within my lifetime? I really think that that's going to happen. We have all the tools and we have plans to do that. And it might even happen with the James Webb Space Telescope coming up.
And what kind of life forms are we talking about here? Are we talking about Star Wars style civilizations, or are we talking about really kind of the fundamental parts of the very primitive sorts of life?
That's a great question. It's probably not going to be the case that we detect full civilizations or even make contacts with them. But more likely, what we're probably going to find within my lifetime are what we call these biosignatures. And these are not like a picture of somebody waving at you from an extrasolar planet or something like that. We actually look for kind of imbalances in the chemistries of these atmospheres of these planets that might indicate something is altering the chemistry in a way that would indicate potentially the presence of life. So this is what astronomers talk about when we talk about detecting life on other planets. We talk about biosignatures, and usually this is just a chemical signature, if you will.
It does sound a bit fantastical when we start talking about alien life, but for you, I mean, the evidence, I'm inclined to believe you, certainly, because as you write, there's so many of these exoplanets out there. Can you give us an idea of, you say about thousands that we've already spotted, but there's more than we've just spotted, isn't there?
Absolutely. So one of the provocative questions that was raised by Carl Sagan, who was this sort of pioneering American astronomer that had this really landmark television series, he raised this question: are there more planets in the universe, or are there more grains of sand on all the beaches of the world? And this is actually a calculation that I do with my students. It's a fairly simple one. And the answer is that there are many, many more planets than there are grains of sand on all the beaches of the world, probably by a factor of 10 or 100. So this is really an amazing idea. Next time you're at the beach, grab a handful of sand and let the sand sort of slip through your fingers and imagine that all of those are planets. We now know that most stars have planets, and we know that the planets that they host are something like our own Earth. They're either sort of more massive versions of our own Earth, or they may even be sort of miniature versions of something more like our own Neptune. We're not really sure what the actual characteristics of them are, but I think just the sheer numbers. And by the way, we don't have a number for this. As I go into the article, the number of exoplanets that we can imagine in the universe would be a 1 followed by 22 zeros. So we don't have a number for that, but that gives you sort of a mind-blowing sense of the scale that we're talking about here. So my feeling is that with such an incredible number of exoplanets, that there must be some possibility for life in the universe. And I think that we are going to see some evidence of the detection of biosignatures in my lifetime.
This is so fascinating because, as you write about in your piece, you also mention the Fermi paradox, this idea that if the universe is so teeming with life, why haven't we spotted anything yet? And obviously, being a paradox, no one has come up with a convincing answer if that satisfies everyone. But I just wonder what you think about the theory that actually the answer to that is something of a dark forest idea, where if you're in a dark forest and other animals are there, but no one is making themselves known, that's because the ones that do make themselves known are the ones that are preyed upon. It does seem like humanity is advertising our existence to the rest of the universe. Could that be an answer to the Fermi paradox, do you think?
Perhaps. I don't know what the answer is. I like your hypothesis, though. I think one of the issues that we face are just the truly staggering distances within the universe, and communication and certainly travel between life forms in the universe is just incredibly prohibitive. But nonetheless, there's a new field that has really emerged in the last 10 or 20 years, and we call it astrobiology. It sounds like a bit of a strange field, but organizations like NASA are taking this very, very seriously. And this is now a well-respected academic discipline. We have journals, we have conferences, we have people that are astrobiologists. And they don't actually do things like sit around and speculate about what kind of skyscrapers an alien civilization might build or something like that. They're actually more studying things right here on Earth, typically sort of microbial life forms that we call extremophiles. And these are, primitive multicellular life forms that might exist in very, very harsh environments on Earth, maybe a very hot undersea ocean vent, or maybe a highly acidic volcanic lake, for example. And so what astrobiologists are interested in learning about is the degree to which life is resilient and can persist in these incredibly harsh environments that we might find on an extrasolar planet that is either very hot, very cold, very strongly irradiated by its host star. And so maybe by learning about these incredible extremophiles here on Earth, we might be able to learn something about the possibility for biology existing on other planets.
That's fascinating. And finally, Sasha, as you alluded to at the beginning, in 30 years, we've made so much progress. Do you think that the speed of progress when it comes to this field is exponential? So we're going to be seeing many more folds of progress in the years to come in a shorter period of time?
Absolutely. The next 2 decades are really going to be an exciting time. I think the best example of this is that in the United States, the National Academy of Sciences convenes a blue ribbon panel of experts that sit together in a room for a couple of years, and they make recommendations for where they think astronomy should go in the next decade. And this has major repercussions for where funding goes in astronomy. And their number one recommendation in their 2020 survey was that NASA should get behind building a dedicated space mission to study a handful of Earth-like planets orbiting other stars, to really search for these biosignatures. And the fact that this committee made this as their number one recommendation means that there are already people working on this mission that will probably fly in the 2040s. So that's why I think it's quite sensible to think that in my lifetime, we'll see evidence of biosignatures detected on another planet.
Sasha, Hinkley, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV.
It's been a pleasure talking with you. Thank you.
That's it for this week. If you enjoy Spectator TV, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss any of our videos. Thanks again for watching, and do join us again next week.